Hello, I'm Hannah Kaplan, and this is the WCS Wild audio podcast, where you'll find reported audio stories covering the latest news and newsmakers from the Wildlife Conservation Society's Global Conservation Program, Zoos and Aquarium, and their many partners. We've got a great show today, so let's get to it. The United Nations Development Program, or UNDP, works in 170 countries and territories around the world to eradicate poverty and reduce inequality. Not surprisingly, that work aligns in a variety of ways with nature conservation. Leading the UNDP's Nature Hub is Midori Paxton. WCS Wild Audio's Nat Moss recently sat down with her to discuss the work of the hub and the implementation of its Nature Pledge.
Growing up in a suburb of Yokohama, Japan, Midori Paxton had only to walk outside into the rice paddies behind her home and the surrounding forest to find herself in nature. At that time, it wasn't yet her passion. It was simply what surrounded her.
I saw and brought back some huge rhino beetles and stag beetles and butterflies in forest. There are some impressive, array of insects in those forests. And also, it's quite surprising how rice paddies are quite teamed with wildlife too. Tadpoles, crayfish, and tiny, beautiful joe-like frogs in those paddies. And so I really liked spending time in those areas. I wasn't feeling how nice it was to be in nature or I love nature, but it was simply a natural thing to do and I had fun.
A Friends of the Earth meeting while attending university in the UK as an undergraduate exchange student opened Midori's eyes to the environment as a global issue.
Up to then, I was more interested in, women's rights, peace, disarmament, that sort of thing that I grew up with. But when I learned about the environmental issues, I immediately thought this was an even more fundamental global issue to solve. So since then, it was very clear I knew that whatever I would do in future, I would work to conserve nature and take care of our environment.
Since the year 2000, that commitment has come through Midori's work with the United Nations Development Program, most recently as director of its Nature Hub. As a UN agency, the UNDP's core mandate is to achieve sustainable, equitable, and inclusive development. To fulfill this mandate, it runs projects in more than 140 countries. Those projects achieve important results each year, but as threats to nature have become more immediately urgent, says Midori, the UNDP wanted to help lead a larger kind of transformation.
Without a major systemic shift, our incremental efforts and achievements through these projects alone will not really get us there to be able to achieve the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, which was agreed at the Biodiversity COP in 2022.
At the biennial meeting of the Conference of the Parties, or COP, to the Convention on Biological Diversity in late 2022, 196 governments each committed to conserve at least 30% of the Earth's terrestrial and marine areas by 2030, commonly referred to as the Global 30 by 30 target. WCS has been working with those governments to help ensure this global target is met. As part of its own effort to support the commitments, the UNDP adopted a Nature Pledge led by Midori.
The Nature Pledge focuses on 3 shifts required to trigger much faster and bigger action around the world. Firstly, it aims to transform the value we place on nature to change people's behavior. People, it could be you, me, businesses, governments, communities. And the second shift is the economic and finance shift, where the value of nature is recognized alongside man-made capital to shift the flows of finance from nature negative to nature positive. And third shift is a policy and practice shift to deliver change at scale on the ground in country, led by governments and stakeholders, and really grounded in local communities and indigenous people.
Among the many stakeholders committed to the 30 by 30 goal, the UNDP, through its Nature Hub, can uniquely leverage its development expertise, whether in governance, human rights, rule of law, health and gender, conflict prevention, or peace building.
How we are positioning this pledge is that this is the UNDP's response to the global biodiversity framework, and to articulate how we are going to support countries to implement national biodiversity strategy and action plans so that collectively we will be able to achieve the targets of the global biodiversity framework.
Critical to achieving those targets, says Midori, is the empowerment of indigenous peoples. The UNDP is well known for its awarding of the annual Equator Prize, which provides recognition and visibility for the outstanding work being done by indigenous peoples to put nature-based solutions into practice and to improve their lives and secure their natural resources. The Nature Pledge supports those goals directly.
Indigenous peoples protect 80% of the world's biodiversity, even though they make up less than 5% of global populations. But also, they are the ones who are very vulnerable, therefore, to degradation or loss of biodiversity and ecosystem services. So indigenous people, therefore, is critical partner. And in the Nature Pledge itself, we focus on improving land tenure of indigenous claimed territories in priority ecosystems, and then to support their really self-determination and control over their landscapes, seascapes, and natural resources.
To achieve the shift in the relationship between nature and finance, there must be a kind of rebalancing. Midori argues that nature remains invisible in economic and financial decision-making, among other reasons because the growth and decline in nature are not captured in GDP calculations. That should change, she says, adding that there was some interesting reporting released during the recent UN climate meeting in Dubai.
During COP28, there was a new report from UNEP, I think State of Nature Finance, and that revealed close to $7 trillion invested annually in nature negative activities. So that's both public and private investment. When nature positive investments or investments in nature-based solutions are only around $200 billion or less. So that really needs to flip.
To achieve the policy shift, UNDP, through its Nature Pledge, is helping 140 countries to integrate nature into their national and sectoral plans and practices.
So, for example, we have target around increased or strengthened conservation areas, including indigenous and community conserved areas. We have a target focusing on improved resilience or decreased vulnerability towards climate change impact for 50 million people. And also a restoration target of 50 million hectares of land and marine areas restored for conservation and food and water security. And we have 100 countries promoting women's leadership and decision-making in natural resource management and closing gender gaps in access and control over natural resources.
Midori understands the many challenges that the protection of nature faces today, whether it be over-reliance on technology, adherence to the status quo for private gain, corruption, or simply human inertia. Nevertheless, she's hopeful that the threats to nature loss can be met.
We have seen a remarkable increase in the interest among private financial institutions, for example, in investing in nature-positive production and businesses. I was even invited to speak in an investors conference in New York, people coming from all over the world as a keynote speaker, which never happened as, somebody doing biodiversity work.
In the final analysis, says Midori, the stakes are not that complicated.
Without nature and without healthy environment, we will not survive.
For WCS Wild Audio, this is Nat Moss.
Today's episode was produced and reported by Nat Moss, with help from Hannah Kaplan and Dan Rosen. The WCS Wild Audio Podcast is a production of the Wildlife Conservation Society. Please join us next week for a new episode, and don't forget to rate or review the show wherever you get your podcast.